Welcome, welcome, everyone. Welcome to Jungian Psychotherapy and Counseling. I'm so happy to have you here today. And as we are joining, go ahead and put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat as we get settled in. So, as you probably know, if you're joining us today, that this is a series that I do once a month. I do a live recording of what will become one of my YouTube videos. So I'm so happy to have you all here. So we've got Angie from Houston, Texas. We've got Terry from Eugene, Oregon. Oh my goodness, now it's coming in so fast I can't read. It's a blur. We got Erica from LA. That's where I'm from. New York City, LA, Utah. Newfoundland, Canada, MFT graduate student from Iowa, Argentina, Santa Barbara, Simi Valley, that's around the corner from me, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, Phoenix, Northridge, woohoo, I used to teach there, California, North Carolina, New York, Florida, Oregon, Iowa, Northern California, Michigan, Nevada, Milwaukee, Canada, Ottawa, Canada, love it, Indianapolis, Phoenix, Omaha, wonderful, Santa Maria, love it. Phillips, graduate student reading my book. Love it, love it. Well, great to have you all here. Today we are going to be talking about Jungian psychotherapy, Jungian psychoanalysis, Jungian counseling. And this is, there's just so many emotions when it comes to Jung for me. I will start by saying it's certainly one of the chapters that I have gotten some of the most interesting feedback on. I have a chapter on Jungian psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in my counseling theory textbooks. And when I did the first version of this book, they send out, if you didn't know this, your textbooks get sent out to all these different reviewers. And I had the most fascinating feedback on this chapter because they sent it out to, I think I got feedback from 16 different faculty around the country who would be possibly using the textbook, right? And one half of the group said, if you put Jung in this textbook, I will not use it in my classroom. I had another half of the group of professors, it was a 50-50 split, who said, oh my God, I love that Jung is in this textbook. I will definitely adopt it because Jung, I will adopt this book because Jung is in the textbook. And I remember calling up my editor. I'm like, so we've got a 50-50 split, like love, hate. And what do you want me to do? We ended up keeping it in because we figured you could always skip it, but you can't really add it. But there was this, strong, visceral, tribal, in response to having Jung in a counseling theory textbook. And it reminded me, though, of another point in my life when I was in my undergraduate at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. I think I saw someone from Virginia here. I got to do a senior project. And so when I was an undergraduate, I had a double major in psychology and East Asian studies, and I was studying Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism to be specific. And so I wanted my, senior year project, at the university to be something that combined my two interests, which were psychology and East Asian studies. And if you didn't know this, Carl Jung has written an introduction to almost every major, text from Buddhism and a lot of the Asian, I think he did some Taoist books as well. But there was always a foreword from Jung, with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I think with the Lao Tzu, he's done all these, introductions in the night, with these texts when they were first getting translated from Asian languages into Western languages. I don't know if it's German or English at the time. I actually would have to go back and look now that I'm giving this workshop. I'm wondering because I know Carl Jung spoke German. He was Swiss and also spent time in Austria, so he was a German speaker. But he did a lot of those introductions. And so anyway, I went to my psych professors and I said, I want to do this project on, Jung's approach, Jung's understanding of Buddhism, because it kind of combined my double major and my psych professor, much like many of those. Half the reviewers from my textbook were like, no, Jung is not a real figure in psychology. We don't respect him. You cannot write a paper on Jung here and get your degree from this university. I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't know. So I share those two stories to just let you know that there is some debate about Jung, but as you probably know, Jung was a contemporary of Freud. They actually worked together in the beginning, and then they kind of went their separate ways. Not under the best of circumstances. So, anyways, I'm excited here to have you here and to just take a look at the Jungian analysis, and hopefully, if you are unfamiliar with it, you will get to learn a bit more. I certainly find it one of the more fun and intriguing and thought-provoking approaches in our field. So, with all of that said, let's go ahead and get started. So I want to always point out, if you've not found this page already, if you go to my therapythatworksinstitute.com to the books page /books, you can scan it with a phone here. If you go ahead and there is a form you can fill out that lets me know if you're a student or professor. It's how I stay in touch with people who use my books. You can get all the forms for all of my books, which include case conceptualizations, both for traditional counseling and psychotherapy theories, as well as family therapy. And it also includes progress note and treatment plan templates and case conceptualization templates. So it gives you all the forms, and we'll be talking about some of those today and in various of the trainings that go with this series. And for those of you attending here live today, you will get a letter of attendance, which is not a CE certificate, but many universities count those as professional training. But you have to attend live and you have to stay to the very end. And you've got to, I'll put it up at 5 minutes before the hour, and you need to just let me know if you don't get it before you leave. But yes, so in the last 5 minutes of training, you can get the certificate for attending if you attended today live. And if not, you can sign up for one of my future live sessions if you're watching this on YouTube. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So hopefully many of you are familiar with my Unifying Framework for Psychotherapy. That is another YouTube video. And in it, I have these 4 levels in terms of comparing all the different psychotherapy approaches. And it's interesting, when you put Jung into this template, this framework, he actually hits a lot of levels. Most approaches kind of hit on 2, and I actually felt like he kind of hits on 3. He certainly looks at the polarities, and so we'll be talking a lot about polarities today. He talks about archetypal polarities, which kind of goes on the behavioral level. He talks a lot about personal narratives, which is interesting because I think it's one of the only theories besides postmodern that touches on these identity narratives and who we are, the stories we tell ourselves. And then he does, I have to give him credit, which is he's also the first person I'm giving credit for touching on cultural narratives. He does it through an archetypal way. It's very different than the way postmodernists do. But when I looked at this theory, this is where he landed, and I do believe he's the only one besides postmodernists, feminists, multiculturalists who touch on societal narratives. So it was very actually interesting to put Jung through the frame, or to put it into this 4-level assessment or framework that I used. So he actually hits on a lot of interesting levels that are kind of unique. So, but you see the emotional level is not as heavy, and also behavioral is not as heavy in terms of and this is when we look at the key concepts and interventions of the approach, they're very cognitive. They're touching on these very broad societal themes and looking at these kind of complementarities. These complementary patterns is really how most approaches conceptualize and do their case conceptualization, but the vocabulary they use are very, very different across the approaches, and Jung's approach is no different on that count. So the least you need to know in a nutshell. So what's interesting is that Jung's approach really does emphasize a lot of cultural and spiritual elements, and not so much religious, I would say, but more spiritual. And Jung is the only one that I know of, and I can think of, out of the 50 major theories that I have spent a lot of my career studying. He talks about this collective conscious, which is this store of universal archetypes, myth, fairy tales, and experiences that are part of each person's psyche, the way they, Jung thought about it. And so there's this concept that there is this unconscious this collective unconscious that has all these myths. Now, it's interesting because in some ways, nowadays we talk a lot in the postmodern literature about dominant discourses, right? And how those shape our identity. And I think, because I like to use a unifying framework and a unifying lens and to look at commonalities, that if we take this language off of it, they're very similar patterns to what the postmodernists talk about as well in terms of dominant discourses. There are these grand narratives, these big stories, these myths, these archetypes, these fairy tales that template us in terms of how our life is supposed to look like, what's good, what's wrong, what's valuable, what makes someone worthy, right? So these narratives really do influence us. And so I've never said it before today, but and it's so funny because you now know in undergraduate, I was interested in Jung's work. I ended up becoming an expert in postmodern therapies, but there is this commonality between the two. If you use the unifying framework and get rid of the jargon and the language, because theoretically they're very different, but for the therapist in the room, there's something very similar going on where you're looking at these broad archetypal, patterns and narratives and stories, In the US, we have the, white picket fence with two kids and a dog is the happy life, right? And so there's this goal that you're supposed to aspire to. That's kind of this kind of archetype. So the goal of counseling is to build a relationship, right, between the conscious and unconscious and the ego and the self. And so it's kind of, in that sense, kind of the making some of the unconscious conscious, very similar to Freud in that way. And then looking at this distinction, we'll go over what the ego and the self are in this approach. And so a lot of what they do here, though, is going to be reminiscent. Jungian approach really evolved at the same time as Freudian work. And so we're analyzing dreams. Jung also liked to look at synchronicities, which is something, I'm in California. People talk about synchronicities all the time here, looking at life patterns. So, but there are these kind of broad life narratives that are the focus of a Jungian practice. And so, the one thing I will say is that a lot, if you look at the reaction of half of the people who reviewed my Jungian chapter who said, don't you dare put this in your textbook, it's not a real theory, or my, undergraduate psychology advisor who's like, no, Jung's not a real therapist. A lot of what Jung's work, and I think where some of that comes from, it doesn't have the pragmatics of some, pragmatic ethics and ethos, not ethics, ethos, that one would expect in 21st century psychotherapy. And so you will see it used a lot less in, county mental health or government, organizations. But you will still see it being popular in private practice, and you certainly can still get trained in Jungian psychotherapy. And so there definitely is an interest in it. But it is considered more of this broader kind of deep dive into a person's psyche rather than, necessarily being used to treat, OCD or ADHD. It can be, and there are people who use it, but it is not something you typically see in an agency or organizational setting. It's just considered a little not pragmatic enough because it doesn't address the behavioral, emotional, and cognitive themes super directly. It does it in much more through these broad and grand narratives. So the juice, significant contributions to the field. For those of you who are new to my work or haven't read a book, I have a section that's always called the juice. And the juice is if there's one thing you remember that any mental health professional can use from this chapter, it should be this. And so I do this to highlight that every theory has something useful for all of us. And so I like to just pull that out and highlight it. So the juice I find very fascinating from Jung is this concept of these universal archetypes that he talks about. So archetypes are basically these unconscious universal patterns that can be traced across cultures and influence how people think, feel, and behave. And so there are many archetypes across that you can see across various cultures. Then we're going to talk about some of them right now, and so Jung studied many cultures. And like I said, he was very much a thought leader in terms of looking at East versus West. And I think that very much influenced his concept of archetypes because when you start looking across cultures, you'll notice that they have these myths, these narratives, these characters, right? You have the trickster, you have the wise old man, the wise old woman, right? So you have the hero. And so you have all of these very similar things across cultures. And so Jung, of course, worked at the turn of the 20th century, and he is coming into contact with some of these freshly, translated for the first time in, human history documents, going, oh my God, these myths, these archetypes, these characters, we have them in the West too. And it's a really fascinating discovery. And it's so funny. I guess I do have empathy for him because, if my unifying framework kind of evolved in the same way as I'm like kind of studying these things that are supposed to be so different. And then you see these really clear patterns that connect them. And that's some of what this archetype is about. So he talks about the ego in a slightly different way than Freud did, in terms of, but he defines it how you see yourself and experience the self. So this is kind of like your conscious experience of the self. It's what you're aware of and how you experience who you are. He then talked about a self that's a higher order self that is whole and complete. And for those of you who are familiar with internal family systems, it reminds me of that self. So the IFS concept of self and the Jungian concept of self is this higher self that is that's more evolved. It's very whole. I always think it was very peaceful. Doesn't talk as much. But it's a higher order self that's just kind of a truer reflection of who you are. And then you have the shadow, which typically is unpleasant, but it's where you stuff all your socially unacceptable, immoral aspects of yourself. And often it is suppressed or unconscious, like you're not always aware of what's in your shadow. And so you've probably have heard of shadow work. It certainly is a Jungian concept, and it comes directly from these archetypes of the self, which is who kind of your conscious experience of yourself. Not yourself. Your ego is the conscious experience of yourself. You have the self, which is the highest kind of pure version of you, and then you have the shadow, which is the darker parts, the more socially unacceptable parts that you kind of shove into your unconscious. So here's some of the common archetypes he talked about. So he talked about what he called anima and animus, so the observation that below the conscious level, that all of us have both a masculine and feminine side. And so we have both masculine and feminine parts within each of us, which is a very interesting concept within some of the discourses today around trans identity and gender identity in general. But from a Jungian perspective, we all have masculine and feminine parts within us. And they may or may not be conscious, but that is part of the whole experience of being human. Then you have the hero archetype, who typically, when you look across mythical literature and religious literature, often there's a divine birth, there's a descent into the underworld, overcoming near impossible obstacles, and having these helpful companions along the way. And there are often themes of defeat, death, and rebirth. And so it's interesting when you look at both the Buddha and the life of Christ, they're actually very similar type of hero narratives. And so we get this hero narrative, and you see it quite a lot. When I talk to folks who work in Hollywood, Diane, they often will say, Diane, there are only 7 stories that are ever told. There are only 7 types of stories. And so these are these archetypes, one of which is the hero's journey is one of those narratives, which is why I mention it. So this hero narrative is something that Jung talked a lot about, and he saw it across various cultures. I always kind of chuckle silently inside when folks from Hollywood will talk about how many, there are only so many actual narratives that the same, it's the same narrative line, just with very different characters and variations. Another set of common archetypes is the wise old man and the wise old woman. And that Jung saw these as archetypes that most world cultures have some variation of these, and they represent humanity's kind of collective wisdom. Some other archetypes include the persona. And this is an interesting one that one of the more practical elements of what we've talked about so far, just in terms of the part of the personality that we use in our interactions with others. So you'll hear this term used kind of generically, I think, within the field, which is why it's in the juice section, where we all kind of have this persona that we use in our social interactions. Now, here's the thing, okay? Now, you're not going to be your authentic self, at work and at home and with your family of origin and in your relationship there, you can think of it as we have different ways of being authentic and that we need to also adjust our expression of self for a given context. And so this persona is the concept of how you present yourself to others. Now, you obviously want the self and the ego to be fairly coherent. And you don't want it to be putting on a very fake persona, but certainly you can have a situation where a client presents a sense of a persona that's not very authentically related, to how they really experience their ego or their self, right? There can be a very artificial persona, or you can have one that's more congruent. Although I think sometimes I hear people talk about being their authentic self and I'm not going to adjust myself for anyone. Well, that's also another extreme doesn't demonstrate emotional intelligence, which is we all kind of have, you're going to be a mental health professional. You need to have a professional persona. It should be authentic, but there is still adapting the self to fit the context. But the persona is a great way to talk about this and reflect on this. And you will certainly have clients come in who will have a very artificial persona that's totally not real. And they even do that to therapists. And in one of my research studies I did on gender and psychotherapy, I had one client or one person in my research study say she would come in and she would present this totally fake persona to her therapist to make the therapist feel better about his clinical skills. Yeah. And so that was not very congruent, right? So realizing that we have, to just look at how we present to people, and that's very different than, my clients who try not to swear in session and I have to give them permission, because they're trying to put on a certain, professional persona with me when there's typical behavior that you would expect in a doctor's office. So that's the persona. There is the trickster, which is a fascinating character that you see across, many, many different cultures. And they are a master of speaking truth through paradox. They are crazy wisdom. I actually talk about this in my Mindfulness for Chocolate book, the trickster character. We're using paradox and humor but speaking truth through paradoxical ways is a very universal character. And if you study some of the classic family therapy, like strategic therapy, they very much embody the trickster archetype within the field of mental health. Whoopsie. Okay, so very good. So those are the archetypes. There are more, but those are some of the main ones that I think are useful to just kind of get a sense of what Jung was talking about. So in terms of people in the story, Carl Jung, he was born in the northeastern province of Switzerland. And he did work with Freud for about 6 years, and he was heavily influenced by Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism. Like I said, he has a foreword to most of the major Eastern texts. And so I ended up reading a lot of Jung when I was studying East Asian studies and Buddhism. And so he's really a fascinating figure. I should also add, when I wrote all my textbooks, I got every book that everyone had ever written. Oh my God. And Jung has written a lot. All I can say is I think it's one of the only authors where I didn't get every single book he's ever written, because I think there were over 100. I was getting them through my library, and there was a point where they're like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do with all these books. He's written a lot, is all I can say. He was extremely prolific and an incredible kind of figure in a lot of different disciplines, actually. So let's look at the overview of the therapy process here. So he conceptualized the process of counseling and psychotherapy in 4 stages. The first is what he called the confession, which is kind of a strange term. I think in the 21st century, ears. But what he meant by this was telling the unedited version of your story, right? So all the good, the bad, and the ugly, the stuff you won't tell anyone else. So he wanted to hear it all, right? The stuff that you wouldn't tell anyone. So that's what he means by confession. It doesn't actually have a religious connotation. The second part is elucidation, which is beginning to identify the patterns, often looking at childhood patterns, but also looking at archetypal patterns, right? So they're beginning to understand all of that. The third part is what he called education, but this is where you're translating all of those insights into your dynamics, into action to solve the presenting problem. And so these are the three main stages of Jungian psychotherapy. And then the fourth phase is what he called transformation. You will often hear alchemy spoken about with Jung. And this was like an optional self-actualization phase. It's interesting. This kind of relates to, I think, what a lot of humanistic therapists talk about, self-actualization. And so Jung is like, just steps 1, 2, 3, take care of the presenting issue that you bring. Where step 4 is this transformation where you become a better human, right? Talked about alchemy and using your suffering to really transform who you are, to live a more full life, a rich life, I think of it, developing resilience and wisdom and really becoming more fully human. So stage 4 is optional. It is self-actualization. And it's interesting because this was before the time of humanistic psychotherapy, but he had that concept kind of embedded into his work, his work as one of the earliest people in the field to talk about self-actualization, becoming more, fully who you are, and really evolving as a human being, becoming wise, becoming resilient, and really developing kind of deeper into your humanity. So let's talk about the therapeutic relationship here, the counseling relationship. So the term he used is an interesting one. He considered it collaborative educators, which when you think about when he was doing his work at the turn of the 20th century, a contemporary of Freud, who was a blank slate and a one-way relationship, this is quite radical. And so he really saw, that there was this collaborative process, and yes, you are an expert who educates your client, but it's still a very collaborative process. So really working with clients to pursue their unique journeys of individuation, but seeing him more as a partner than as a director, and offering information and insight regarding the roles of archetypes and meaning without kind of cramming it down anyone's throat, I think would be the way to say it. And very similar to, Freud was this concept of healer, heal thyself, which is the practitioner, the therapist, the counselor needs to be doing their own work first to be able to guide others. So the concept really was that, the therapist needs to engage in this archetypal journey of healers, that healer heal themselves. The healer is an archetype. And part of the archetype, if you were unaware, was that, people become healers usually because they were wounded and need to heal themselves, right? Maybe and in our field, oftentimes you went through childhood, there's a higher percentage rate of adverse childhood events for people who become mental health professionals. You probably went to therapy, got some help, and to say, hey, I want to help other people this way. I mean, that's certainly my story. So, and for Jung, this was a real important concept, and that, that the personal work you need to be doing is with the archetypes, the unconscious, the collective unconscious, because it's going to be the only way to help others. And so this runs very parallel. I mean, it's different and distinct from Freud, but this concept of you can only help someone evolve as much as you've done your own work. And so that's a really big part of being prepared to be the clinician in Jungian analysis. So now let's look at the viewing and case conceptualization. So, and we're going to talk about these a little separately too, but there's the collective unconscious is very much important here. The term complex and catharsis, polarities, and gosh, I had to practice this and now I don't know if I can do it. Antidromia, I totally messed that up. And then if you're familiar with the Myers-Briggs, it is based on the work of Carl Jung and a mother-daughter team called Myers and Briggs. So let's look at collective unconscious first. So, like I said, it's Jung posits that there is this collective unconscious conscious that exists beyond the individual and represents the evolutionary mind of humanity. So that's a pretty big concept. So it's like there is something beyond all of us that we can kind of tap into, often through our dreams, but that shape our own individual consciousness and, and more that there is an unconscious that is more than just at the individual level, that we all kind of plug into this, human level of unconscious, uh, humanity's level of consciousness. So it's this collective unconscious. And he considered that the structure of our personalities, that we did have this conscious mind, which is everything we're aware of, and then we have a personal unconscious, which is very similar to Freud, and that there was a collective unconscious. It's kind of like plugging into humanity's, level of consciousness. And so it's a really interesting concept. You don't see it in other places. And what's interesting though to me is that even though I feel like we're going deeper, 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 that this takes us to these dominant discourses that we talk about in postmodern therapy, where there are these myths, there are these archetypes that tell us how to live our life, what's good, what's bad. And so, what it means to be a worthwhile human being. And those are kind of tapping into something that he would call this collective unconscious. And so this is where I think some people are like, oh, this is too woo-woo and spiritual and all that good stuff. And so this is where some people are like, this is too strange for me. So complexes and catharsis. So complexes are, in Jungian approach, are just emotionally charged sets of responses. So this is like, he'd do free association. He was a contemporary of Freud. And that oftentimes to very neutral words, people would have very emotionally charged, responses. So something like ocean, you might, be like danger, right? So that's kind of scary. And maybe that's because you had some kind of experience along those lines. Or you might have, something like flowers, and you could have this very emotionally negative, emotionally charged event. And so, of course, he would get curious as to what those are about. And he called these, I think we'd call them triggers in the 21st century, that when you're getting triggered by something, that's a complex, using Jungian terms. And so he would want to get curious and analyze and identify what's going on to create from a relatively neutral response, a very strong emotional reaction that could be positive or negative, I guess, theoretically, but normally we think of it in negative terms. And so catharsis is kind of how you cure a complex, which is an emotional release. In terms of exploring whatever the event is. So let's say you find this complex, exploring it and getting to a place where the client experiences this emotional release so that they can view the ocean or the flowers without a negative emotional response. And so this is a lot of what they're working through and kind of conceptualizing in treatment. So Freud talks a lot about polarities, if you don't, I am the queen of the Unifying Framework. So when I come here, I'm like, oh, this is so much like Gestalt. So if you're familiar with Gestalt therapy, I think Jung and Gestalt talk about polarities in very similar ways, but they're personality traits that either get magnified or minimized. And in either case, they lead to pathology. And I will tell you this, at some point in my career, I am going to write a book that's just on complementary patterns and polarities, because when you look across all of the major schools and approaches in the field, the key difference in terms of how they conceptualize is around these complementary patterns. But almost all of them talk about any polarity, any exaggerated polarity tends to lead to pathology, whether it's intrapsychic or interpersonal. And so they're looking for these polarities in the psyche, primarily, not relationships, is part of what they're talking about. And then there is this concept of enantidromia, which refers to Heraclitus's law that everything sooner or later turns into its opposite. So they're looking for how, let's say you're trying to be hyper logical, like logical and emotion. That's a polarity, right? And so you can be super emotional or you can be super logical. And if you take either polarity to their extreme, you kind of flip around and become the opposite. So I think of people who are super, super logical, right? And they just focus very much on linear logic. And at a certain point, they become very emotional about whatever they're hyper logical about, right? So we've all experienced that sort of thing. And so even with someone who's super, super emotional, they can turn that into a point where it comes out as a very logical argument. So any polarity taken to its extreme, um, sooner or later can turn into having elements of the opposite that they're trying to avoid. And again, this is a book I will write at some point. I think it's probably 10 years in the future at this point in my career. But yeah, humanity, we struggle with polarities, and there's so many polarities that are really the crux of so many of our problems, really, both interpersonal and intrapersonal and interpersonal. That this whole learning how to navigate polarities, and it's very hard to always find that tension, the balance point, or being able to, sometimes it's not really a balance point. Sometimes it's being able to embrace both sides of polarities, like male and female energies, right? So learning how to engage these differences is I think a lot of what we spend our time here as humans dealing with. So Jung also talked about these psychological types. And so when Jung talked about them, he did not put them into a personality type profile like we have with the Myers-Briggs today. That happened based on his work but he did talk about psychological types. He is the first one to talk about the extrovert and introvert, to my knowledge. And so when Jung talks about extroverts, he's talking about the individual's attention, kind of like their default level of attention tends to go outside of themselves and to the outer world. Like just sitting in an empty room, they're looking around the room, okay? In comparison to introverts, where their energy tends to just move inward. So if they're sitting in an empty room, they're lost in their world of thoughts. And so introverts, their default attention tends to go inward. So this isn't so much about who's the life of the party, because in theory either could be, but it's more like where their attention is, where their mind is, how they tend to think through the world, like just where are they in a default state. And so, and it is true, though, the stereotype that extroverts, the life of the party, they're always talking, they always have friends and people around them. That is a stereotype that tends to hold true, but it's not 100% true. And it's not the concept that was really behind these terms for Jung. He was just looking at where a person's kind of energy goes to, where their focus goes. Then he talked about the thinking and feeling types. Where the thinking types tend to really prefer analysis and logic, and feeling types tend to focus more on values and morality. And when we get into the Myers-Briggs, this is how a person makes decisions, what they're emphasizing more in one direction or the other. And then he also talked about intuitive versus sensing types. And so the intuitive type here relies very heavily on unconscious and collective unconscious information. So the intuitive, that's so, in Jung's world, this unconscious, collective unconscious, that's more of what he would call intuition, and being able to connect with that and listen to that, be attuned to that, get the messages from a more intuitive sense. In the Myers-Briggs typology today, the intuitive type is the big picture and patterns. They look at pictures and patterns, which you think of archetypes are kind of picture patterns, right? Versus the sensing type which take in information more through the five senses. So the sensing types tend to be the detail-oriented people. They drill down and become very expert at things, where the intuitive types tend to be the big picture thinkers, and they're looking at big patterns. And so they have very different learning styles. As an educator, intuitive types, you need to give them the big picture first. This is where we're going and why we're talking about it. And then they can, kind of like the outline. And then when you run through the details, they can hang all the details, right? But without the big picture, intuitive types are lost. Where conversely, the sensing types, if you give them the big picture in the beginning, they really don't quite get it. And then once you connect all the dots and line up all the details, then they see the big picture. So I always talk about the teaching sandwich. You do the big picture, all the details, and then the big picture again. That's always how I try to teach, just because that's that way, because your audience is roughly 50-50. Both halves of your audience can follow along with what you're doing. So this is a really great one. This is a good one even for as a mental health professional. Intuitive types, they can feel like they understand with pretty broad strokes. They do need the big picture to follow along with what you're saying. Whereas sensing types, they may need you to give examples or to give more details before they really get it. Now, if you're doing something like assigning homework at the end of a session, your intuitive type is going to think they understand what to do, whether or not they actually do. I think you got a 50-50 chance there. The sensing types might ask a lot more questions, or at least they need you to give a lot more detail for them to know what they really need to do, for that homework assignment between sessions. So I even use this clinically to just communicate better with my clients. And then finally, there is this distinction between judging and perceiving that were added by the mother-daughter team, Myers and Briggs. And this is the difference. So the first three kind of polarities on the Myers-Briggs, the first three, because judging, perceiving come last. The first three come straight out of the work of Carl Jung, and you will see it in his writing. What they added was they called the judging type and the perceiving type, where the judging type likes to have things planned and organized and structured, where perceiving types really like to explore possibilities, look at things from multiple perspectives. They're much more spontaneous. They handle change better. It's funny, judging types, their anxiety goes down when the decision and the plan are, made and outlined. Okay, I've got a plan. Whoosh, my stress has just gone down. What's funny is that perceiving types, oftentimes their stress goes up. Once the plan is finalized, there's an outline, their stress can go up because now they know that they're going to be missing out on all these different possibilities. They can't change their mind. And so when I do a lot of couples work, and when you have a judging and a perceiving type, who are married to each other, you will find that there is a lot of conflict that happens between those two, because what makes one anxious makes the other one relax. And so it's vice versa. So they have, their approach to kind of planning a vacation or putting together a schedule, you name it, there's a lot of room for kind of tripping each other up. And actually, on the Myers-Briggs, any opposites here can create tension for a couple. So let's look at goal setting in Jungian approach. So the ultimate goal would be individuation. And so this is more towards that, we talked about the fourth stage of transformation, this is more that concept, but it's building a bridge between the conscious and unconscious and the ego and the self, and I capitalized it like IFS, to create a really unique sense of individuality that is fully consciously chosen and embraced. And so some of the kind of goals that you might have in this approach is facilitating catharsis related to a childhood, experience or trauma, increasing awareness of the persona and how it is maintained, especially if it's very kind of out of sync with yourself, and increasing awareness and acceptance of shadow elements of the self. So kind of looking at those kind of repressed parts of the self, those disowned parts of the self. And again, I just feel like I'm slipping straight into a Gestalt therapy here. And that is why I created a unifying framework, because I do think these approaches really do link up. So let's look at some of the interventions in this approach. So they do a lot of work with symbols and dream analysis. No surprise there at the turn of the 20th century. But dreams in Jungian approach are viewed differently. In Freud, they kind of have a lot to do with the kind of unconscious drives, and often aggressive drives or sexual drives. These are more like, Jung had multiple ways that he thought the dreams could be interpreted. So he has a much more varied approach, but dreams viewed as messages from the unconscious that compensate for whatever your one-sided conscious attitude is. So it's kind of like hearing from your shadow is one of the ways that dreams are viewed. But there are a lot of symbols and symbolic meanings that are universal as well as personal. So he's looking for those archetypes. He's looking for universal meanings as well as very personal meanings from your own history. Um, and so looking at these archetypal patterns and what the psyche is trying to communicate to us. And so in Jungian approach, we're looking at dreams. There's a little much more of a more flexible collaborative. We talk about collaborative educator, right? There's a more of a collaborative. What could this mean? And you're considering, the expert is bringing in the clinician is bringing in knowing what these symbols typically mean based on myth and mythology and folklore and the kind of grand archetypes. And then we're also having the client bring in their own unique interpretations of these events and kind of working together to kind of decode the dreams. I will say, if you've ever seen any of those dream dictionaries, I think they are very much based on Jung's approach to analyzing dreams more than Freud's approach. Then you also have active imagination, which is kind of dreaming forward in some ways. But this is when you're going to consciously engage engage with this unconscious material while awake, and by having dialogue with whatever character maybe showed up in your dream or whatever image or feelings. So this is where you have the dream or you have the experience. And you get this unconscious kind of material or these archetypal dreams, and then you consciously engage and you craft it. Like, what was the message that the old man in your dream or the old woman in your dream gave you last night? What does that mean to you? And what does that tell you about your life? And is there anything you want to change based on that message you got, for example, or that image you got in your dream? And so this is what they call active imagination, but it's kind of taking that archetypal or unconscious material and then working with it to improve whatever the presenting issue is. So you could have a conversation with a character in the dream. You can paint an image that emerged, or follow whatever the fantasy was, and look at what are the implications for real world life and any changes the client might need to make, especially related to whatever the presenting issue is. And so it's creating this very conscious bridge between the conscious and unconscious minds and allowing them to kind of influence each other. And one of the more practical ways I think I've used a variation of this is in working with nightmares, often with clients. I will have them take that nightmare, and this is normally with someone who's had a traumatic experience and they're replaying it. I've had a lot of success with taking that nightmare, kind of chopping off as soon as things started to get tense and rewriting the narrative, right? Let's have a heroic ending to this narrative, whether it's the client or someone rescues them or they rescue themselves. What kind of narrative, how would they have preferred this to unfold? And then having them replay that, right? And talk through that and experience it and visualize it. And so I've had a lot of clients with very difficult traumas be able to handle or, reduce their nightmares using a variation of this active imagination to just kind of shift the nightmare plot and storyline. Shadow work, which you hear a lot about, I think, in popular literature, about delving into the shadow, and it comes straight out of Jungian therapy here, but it's beginning to recognize and integrate the rejected or disowned parts of a person's self. And so it's often involves noticing what projections you have for others. So like whoever annoys you the most, whatever type of people, whatever things annoy you the most, those are probably giving you a hint of what's in your shadow. Okay, if you have strong emotional reactions to others, and I mean, just read the news, oh my God, and you can just watch everyone's shadow in action. But those strong reactions people see to others, is normally part of the shadow self. So you're going to explore why you have that strong reaction, often going back to childhood, and then gradually going back and kind of claiming these split off parts. Again, I just feel like I'm talking about Gestalt here. So you'll see those themes in other approaches. And, it's funny, I have a colleague who used to call it trapdoor morality. And when you look at a lot of very There are a lot of religious leaders who have, often will advocate for kind of very strong, rigid religious positions, and and yet, you find out 10 years later there's this crazy scandal of one form or another, and it's because they kind of push so far to one extreme of purity, and you're going to be the most pure spiritual person possible, and oftentimes they have some of the most depraved trapdoor morality where, oh, these rules don't apply to me. And you'll see that dynamic, and that's the shadow in action, right? They can be have very inappropriate sexual lives. I'll leave it there. It's usually the most common form of this. And so that's the shadow at work. And so the goal is not so much to eliminate the shadow, but it's to develop a conscious relationship with it. So if you, let's say, are preaching about, chastity and sexual purity, and yet you have these urges to do very unpure things, you're going to look at that and understand it and hopefully develop a healthier relationship to your sexuality. So that's what the concept here of shadow work is about. Jung also talked about transference and countertransference, and he described the therapeutic relationship as an alchemical vessel where both people are transformed. He liked the word alchemy. It's bigger in his day. And so, but this is a place where both people get transformed through the process. And he's attending always to what is getting activated both in the therapist and the client, and seeing it as meaningful, not just a distortion, right? Because in Freud talked a lot about, this distortion, these projections onto the therapist. And Jung's kind of more curious about why is the therapist triggering the client in this way, and why is the client triggering the therapist in this way? What's going on? What are the complexes being triggered? And again, you're looking for the archetypal patterns that are playing out between the therapist and the client. He talks about synchronicities, which are these meaningful coincidences that occur and connect the inner world with the outer world. And so Jung takes synchronicities very, very seriously. So if you were processing something around, let's say a parent, and all of a sudden you meet three other people who do the same thing your parent did, or whatever it was, that would be significant. That would be, from Jung's perspective, the universe kind of talking to you. Now, this is, again, too woo-woo for a lot of mental health professionals, which is where I think, you get some of that people not liking. Did I say Freud? I hope if I said Freud, I meant Jung. Or some people are like, Jung's just too woo-woo for me. But synchronicity and having these chance encounters are something that really spoke to Jung. And so they're looking at these moments and exploring them, what the psyche might be trying to express, and really kind of understanding this relationship. But he saw these synchronicities as kind of coming from the unconscious mind. If you've ever heard of sand play or sand tray therapy, it is a derivative of Jung and his archetypal work. And so you have a sand tray, and it's kind of like this represents their conscious and subconscious minds, and that there is a full system. It is something you get trained in, that clients, and you do both with adults and with children, creating scenes in the sandbox using figures. And they believe that it really bypasses a lot of the verbal defenses to allow access to the unconscious, and allowing the unconscious to express itself through symbols. So if you do true sand play, there is a whole evolution of characters, and they go from rocks and plants to animals, all the fish, amphibians, mammals, humans, all the way up to spiritual beings. There's a whole system for how you organize and lay them out. And it's interesting, in this approach, the therapist is very much observing what's going on and not interpreting, and they're witnessing without initially even interpreting, and letting the psyche self-heal. So it's a very self-healing process that they allow the client to kind of work through some of these unconscious complexes. In terms of research and the evidence base, it was not considered an evidence-based approach, but it is interesting. There's this one study that 76% of long-term Jungian analysis patients showed significant reduction in health insurance claims 5 years post-services. But in general, Jungian is a much longer term kind of approach to really delving into unconscious. Myers-Briggs research, there is a lot on that. Not so much as predicting personality, but it's used a lot in the business world for career, for communication. Um, and so there's a lot of research in using the MBTI. It's not considered some kind of stringent psychological measure, but there's a lot of practical applications in businesses often, and human resource departments like to use it. In career counseling, they use it a lot too. And I actually did career counseling for many years with the military, and I found it to be, we had all these standardized measures, right? But the Myers-Briggs was the most useful to help folks leaving the military figure out their next career path. And I always thought it was so, because we did aptitude, we did ability, we did interest, we did all these standard career measures. And the clinically most useful one was always the Myers-Briggs, and figuring out what their next step was. In terms of applications with diverse populations, there are some, really kind of fun invitations when working with cultural diversity, to look at cultural myths and folklore and symbols within a given culture, and also the spiritual practices, and weaving that into the therapeutic process as well as the client's life. In terms of sexual identity diversity, Jung, I think, offers a really nice kind of template or starting point to discuss gender, because this concept that everyone has a certain amount of male and female within them is kind of the starting point for discussion in Jungian psychology. And so I think it offers a great starting point to look at some of these ideas that are present in the 21st century. So wrapping up here, I'm going to take some questions really quick, but Jung really distinguishes itself as a depth psychology that has this concept of the collective unconscious and archetypes. And I think it really just explores a lot of our just humanity, our experience of being human in a very different way. And like I said, you're not going to find it in a lot of, in county mental health organizations. But it certainly is a fascinating, a very kind of fascinating approach that, I've certainly have drawn from many times over the years. Okay, awesome. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to see if anyone has questions. You can put your questions in the chat. And if you're attending and watching this live, I just put the link to get your CE certificate in the chat. So feel free to go ahead and grab that. And awesome. Oh, this is a great question. Can you talk about using this approach with grief? I think this is a beautiful approach to use with grief, in terms of looking at archetypal journeys, right? And so, looking at someone's life and what was their life journey like, is it someone who evolved into a wise woman? Is it someone who became a bitter old man? Is it someone who died young? There are all these like archetypal themes around a person's life and what it meant, right? Was there tragedy? Was it comedy? So kind of looking at, let's see. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm seeing the link went to the panelists, which was me. Try that link. Sorry, the default in Zoom is always to just send it to the panelists. So, yeah, so with grief, you have a way of, I think it's a beautiful approach in terms of looking at the life story and narrative and the archetypal themes in the deceased person's life or your own life, the person who is grieving, to look at those various archetypal themes. I think it creates it's got a beautiful language and imagery and interventions for, grief has all of us hopefully pause and reflect on what are we doing with our lives? What is our purpose? And so it invites you to do some of that deeper work, which I think Jungian analysis is definitely equipped to do. When you think of grief, a lot of my folks who grieve have dreams, right? And what are the significance of those dreams? And so that's also, I think, a good way to think of Jung, or use Jung with Jungian ideas with someone who is grieving. I'm sorry, I'm trying to manage a lot of things here. So I think, the looking at the life narrative, looking at the dream analysis, and then also looking at the personas. Oftentimes with grief, all of our masks come off. Someone just put in there that persona. What was the word for mask? Persona is a Latin word for mask. There you go. That persona, that mask, grief often invites us to take off that mask and look inside it a little bit deeper. And I think Jung's approach with the archetypes really, gives you language to reflect on some of that. So that's a great one. Great question. Okay. Okay. So, so I got a question here. As we work with Gen X and maybe boomers, how might the archetypes help with the next stage, past stages? So Gen X. So So yeah, you can certainly use this concept of archetypes across a person's, lifespan. So you got the boomers and Gen X, kind of moving into, at least this time of history, recording of this video, into retirement, into becoming, older, wiser. What does that mean? You have kind of, and looking back over your life, are you happy with your journey thus far? And I think Jung's use of archetype, folklore, myth, and even just the various ways of thinking about the self can be powerful in that way. And you can use it, even if folks in, young adulthood similarly can also be used in that way. Okay, so hopefully, folks are, it looks like hopefully getting their letters. I'm trying to grab some of these questions. We've got a whole bunch coming in here. Um, I mean, there isn't a lot of research. And I haven't done a literature review in several years, but I think it's because it's, you do research on things that are easy to measure. There's nothing here like in a collective unconscious that's easy to measure, I think is really what it is. And to do research in psychotherapy, you have to be able to really concretize and streamline and, create manualize and, root clear set of interventions. And, Jung just doesn't fit into those boxes. And so it's just harder, I think, to even just measure. It's harder to conceptualize what's going on. It's harder to measure what's going on. But that said, there are still Jungian training institutes around the globe that are very active. So there is still this very strong interest in these ideas because it does bring in a level of spirituality, of depth of meaning. And it's funny, I was just reading an article this morning around that lifelong happiness is so correlated to having purpose and meaning in your life. And I would say Jung addresses that better than a lot of other mental health approaches. Okay, awesome. Hello, Patrice is here from Kenya. Great to have you here. The teachings are, yeah, fascinating and eye-opening. Never saw it this way before. Awesome. Got folks from Kenya here. What time? It's late there. Great to have you here. Um, okay. Great, great, great. How do you access my Unifying Framework? I'm going to be doing a training coming up in the new year on the Unifying Framework. It is also, there should be a YouTube video. I think I still have one posted somewhere. And I do teach a master class on how to use it. So in terms of specific, just put in Jungian training near me. I mean, obviously in Switzerland, there's a huge institute. In California, we have training both in LA. Santa Barbara has a university that uses a lot of Jungian. So any major city in the United States, throughout Europe, I know for sure. I cannot speak to Kenya, but I know in the US and Europe and Canada, most major cities have an active Jungian training center. And so it's definitely, and in Santa Barbara here, there is an institute called the Pacifica Institute where a lot of Jungian work gets done. So it's definitely alive and well. And okay. And so the link for the letter of attendance, there are no continuing educations, is in the chat if you're attending live. If you're watching on YouTube, you have to attend the next one live to get your letter of attendance. Okay. Yeah, great Gen X question. Yes, the next phase. And it's a good question, I think, to ask at midlife for our clients who are at that Awesome. Okay, people are saying thank you. Okay. Someone's asking, how would a consumer of Jungian therapy weed out or fraud or misuse of Jung's therapy? I mean, you would want to find someone who's formally trained in it, is what I would say. You want to go to someone who has been to one of these training institutes. Similar, if you're going to do, psychoanalysis, you want someone who can, provide evidence that they've been formally trained. Jung is not something you read the textbook and you go try to use on your clients, an hour later. It's something you go to multiple years of training to learn how to do. So, okay. Yeah, so someone's saying, yeah, Joseph Campbell does use a lot of Jungian archetypes. And so, yeah, this was great. Awesome. And someone's asking about POTS training. I think I've seen it, but off the top of my head, I cannot put that together. So you're going to have to spell that out for me. Yeah, so Merlene is saying that, yeah, she just loves Jung's self-psychology model because it's very spiritual and talks about the archetypes and persona. It's fascinating. I've always had fun with Jung. It's probably not the one I draw the most from because most of my clients I don't think are processing quite at this level, but it's always been a very, very fascinating. His whole career in terms of looking at both Eastern and Western psychology. If you know my history, because I've done a lot of work in Buddhist psychology and mindfulness, I certainly find his way of thinking very fascinating. Is there another framework that pairs well with this? I would say actually IFS is a possibility, but Gestalt is very close to his work as well when you look at some of the polarities and such. So I would say Gestalt work is also. Uh, yes, I don't know what you're going to have to spell out what POTS is. I cannot. It's an acronym, so you're going to need to spell that out. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, awesome, awesome. Okay. Oh, person of the therapist is training. Is that what POTS is? Okay. Yeah, there's so many acronyms in our field. So in terms of person of the therapist, I mean, Jung would be saying that and it's very similar and aligned with a lot of psychodynamic therapists, that we really need to be working on ourselves. And so if you are easily triggered, I will just say it this way, put it into 21st century. If you are easily triggered, if you find yourself in polarities either within yourself or with other people, that is where you have a homework assignment to go and work through that and learn how to have, let's say, difficult relationships with difficult people. We live in very difficult times. We live in very challenging times. And it's very tempting to get very polarized and get pulled into the polarization that's happening at every level of our society and our communities and our relationships. And I certainly, as a couples therapist and family therapist, I see it. I've seen over the past decade how even individual couples, I cannot believe how the polarizing dynamics we're seeing in our communities and our societies is trickling down to the couple level, right? And so, I would say then using this approach, we have a kind of an ethical, if not a moral duty to really look at ourselves and how we get pulled into these polarities, what is going on for us, and how do we become just more conscious and aware of our unconscious processes, how we get pulled into these dynamics. And so looking at our own dynamics, our own complexes, looking at why things trigger us, because it is possible to be, observe difficult things in life and injustice in life, and to name it, recognize it, see it without losing your emotional center, without coming unraveled. And that is something I think that we need to, if you ask me how a person of the therapist works, Jung says he sets a high bar for who we need to be as human beings in doing this work. Great. Oh, someone's asking, why do I think Jung gets so little attention? And it's because it's too esoteric. It's got a very strong spiritual bent to it. And so there's some people who are like, dreams don't have those meanings, synchronicities don't have those meanings. Really, we're going back to myths and archetypes. It's just too airy-fairy for a lot of people. If you think of like CBT being the dominant, it's very scientific sounding. This is not very scientific sounding. And I think because of that, we have third party payers who demand science, behind what we do. I think it's because it's a little out there for people. Yeah. There is no letter. There are no CEUs. CEUs actually cost a lot of money to offer, and so I do that a couple times a year for free. But these are just this is just a letter of attendance that usually only benefits grad students, as far as I know. Okay, thank you, Moniki. Man, you almost sound like you work for me. Great, love it, love it. Thank you for answering those questions. Okay, I hope I answered most of these, and I hope you have some fun. I don't know why. I just find there's a question here I missed. Oh, Jack, if I had to choose Freud or Jung, oh, absolutely every day it would be Jung. Just too much fun. I just have fun with Jung. It just there's something like a breath of fresh air with Jung in the sense of, oh yeah, let's think more broadly about what it means to be human and this journey of being human. So I also think he touches on existential themes. Um, so yeah, Marlene's with me. Yes, of course, Jung is fun. Freud is kind of a downer. He's kind of like cynical to me. So I'm much more of a Jung girl because there is this, I guess Jung makes me step back and look at this whole journey of being human with a lot more humility, curiosity, and just even eagerness to live more fully. So I don't know, Jung helps me to feel alive. So if I had to choose Jung or Freud, yeah, everyone else in the chat, we all showed up for today. So that's why. Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you all enjoyed this, and I hope it's advice. I know for some of you, you haven't had any training in Jung because, as you just learned at the beginning, that there are a lot of professors who don't even want it in a textbook, and even if it's there, they won't cover it because it's a little too woo-woo for some people. But I certainly have. I have it's fun to use Jung. I use it with dream analysis. It can always be helpful for that. And so hopefully you got some inspiration for today, and hopefully in the years ahead you'll find clients and situations where it is useful to bring Jung into your work. Okay. Oh my God, Avalon, you never even heard of Jung until today? Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, he is covered in my theory and treatment planning and counseling textbooks. And so I'm so glad you got to experience Jung. I don't know, just always a breath of fresh air and uplifting to the spirit for me. Okay, everyone. You can check out my YouTube Live website. I will be doing another workshop next month. Don't quote me. I think it might be Carl Rogers. So great. Oh, wow. Yeah, Elaine from the Philippines is here. We got Kenya, Philippines. I saw New Zealand. I love it. We got the whole world represented. So thank you, Mary Beth. She likes my textbooks. Love it, love it. So wish you all the best. And this video will be up on YouTube by the end of the week, which will be next week because we're recording this on a Friday. But it'll be up next week. I promise. Okay. 11:14. Thank you, Ellen. She's on it. Person-centered seminar. Yes. Carl Rogers. I love Carl Rogers too. Okay. We're going to have fun next month. So be well and take care. Bye-bye.